So today's Founder-Acarya Essentials lesson is called his ISKCON branch. Shocking as it was, the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in January 1948 only intensified Prabhupada's desire to spread the movement of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and Lord Chaitanya. Unable to engage the Mahatma during his life, Abhay would now engage him in death to launch his mission as, quote, the Gita Nagari. So Gandhi was assassinated, and then immediately Prabhupada switched gears, so to speak. He pivoted to a strategy to approach Indian leaders, business leaders and government leaders, to appeal to them that if you really want to honor Gandhi's life, then I can show you how to make a whole community based on Gandhi's favorite book, the Bhagavad Gita. And Prabhupada called this the Gita Nagari community. Quote, this is from his presentation. The Gita Nagari will properly utilize the huge resources of Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Fund. Gandhi's memory can be well preserved by his exemplary activities, and not simply by constructing huge buildings or dead stone statues. Mahatma Gandhi was saintly reformer, and his memorial fund may be utilized for the purpose of converting degraded persons into saintly order, unquote. Prabhupada urged the fund's director to, quote, keep in motion Gandhi's spiritual movements. And Prabhupada breaks the movements down this way. His prayerful recitation of sacred sounds, his restoration of deities to temples, his recognition of everyone as a Harijan, a person of God, and his ideal of a spiritually harmonious society. Quote, the above fourfold Gandhi movements, he wrote, if done in an organized, scientific way, supported by all the authentic scriptures of all religions, will bring in that tranquility of peace and a respite from all harshness and bitterness of the present world, which we have longed for till now, unquote. So that was Prabhupada's appeal to business and government leaders, but it fell on deaf ears. But fresh from independence, India's leaders only longed to be, quote, modern, and were uninterested in Prabhupada's spiritual proposals. So that was the first face that Prabhupada put on his mission after World War II. He launched back to Godhead at the end of the war, and then he was thinking how to actually have a spiritual revolution in the world, per Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and the six Goswamis and Lord Chaitanya's vision. So Prabhupada thought, well, no one knows me, but everybody knows Gandhi. Everybody loves Gandhi. So he wanted to engage Gandhi, but then Gandhi was assassinated. So Prabhupada still tried to use Gandhi's memory, but the leaders weren't interested. Undaunted, in 1952, he found his first receptive audience among medical students in the northern Indian town of Jhansi. One of the students was able to connect Abhay, and Prabhupada at that time was called Bhaktivedanta Prabhu. As you remember, in the 40s, a couple of godbrothers were impressed with his speaking and writing in English. So they gave him the title Bhaktivedanta Prabhu. So one of the medical students was able to connect him with a pious estate executor who let Bhaktivedanta Prabhu use the estate's property and buildings to teach and to rebrand his mission as the League of Devotees. So that was the second brand or face Prabhupada thought of using for his mission. When nobody went for Gita Nagari, then he used a popular phrase of the day, league. There was a Muslim league, of this league, of that league. So Prabhupada said, League of Devotees. Canvassing among the students, Prabhupada ran an ad in the local newspaper. Quote, wanted candidates from any nationality to qualify themselves as real Brahmins for preaching the teachings of Bhagavad Gita for all practical purposes throughout the whole world. Deserving candidates will be provided with free boarding and lodging. Apply A.C. Bhaktivedanta, founder and secretary of the League of Devotees. Unquote. That was the ad. Very ambitious. Prabhupada didn't have any resources or followers, but he was thinking the whole world even then. The peace that the League of Nations had failed to bring after World War I, that the United Nations would also fail to bring after World War II, the League of Devotees would now bring through systematic spiritual education, quote, and thereby achieve real unity and peace of the contending elements of the present world, unquote. The events that would compel Prabhupada to eventually set aside the League, leave his family, accept the renounced order of life, and finally journey solo to the West have been well documented in Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. What concerns us here is how he finally established his mission as ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, unfolding its purposes in distinct phases. So there were 7 purposes to ISKCON. So what we're going to take a look at is how Prabhupada proposed to accomplish those purposes in 4, I call them phases. Prabhupada used the term movements, and he also used Rupa Goswami's waves, as in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the different waves of the ocean of devotion. But I'm just going to use the word phases. A branch of Lord Chaitanya's movements. In his commentary to the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Leela 12.73, Prabhupada identifies ISKCON as a, quote, branch, unquote, of the Bhakti Kalpa Taru, Lord Chaitanya's, quote, desire tree of devotional service. Though but a branch, his mission carries the spiritual power to transplant the, quote, tree of love of Godhead worldwide. Prabhupada memorably begged for that empowerment in the poem he wrote the day he landed in America. As one verse reads, quote, "O Lord, I am just like a puppet in your hands. So if you have brought me here to dance, then make me dance. Make me dance, O Lord. Make me dance as you like." Unquote. During his first year in the West, when the Lord revealed to Prabhupada, he would have to start a fresh branch of the Lord's mission. The same educational purpose he had announced for the League of Devotees, he now declared in ISKCON's incorporation papers. So this is the first purpose. And it reads like a final draft of the League of Devotees. Quote, "To systematically propagate spiritual knowledge to society at large, and to educate all peoples in the techniques of spiritual life in order to check the imbalance of values in life, and to achieve real unity and peace in the world." Unquote. 6 more purposes followed, all reflecting the same educational mood and mission. So that was in 1966. It was July 13th, Prabhupada officially incorporated ISKCON, 1966. In 1976, 10 years after he had incorporated ISKCON, Prabhupada was back in New York City to celebrate Rath Yatra, the temple's first chariot parade. Reflecting on his society's global expansion in such a short time, Prabhupada compared ISKCON to Varahadev, the Lord's boar incarnation. As Lord Varaha had appeared from the nostril of Lord Brahma and then quickly assumed a cosmic form, so ISKCON had appeared in a tiny storefront on New York's Lower East Side and quickly covered the earth. It had done so because Prabhupada had been utterly and absolutely surrendered to Krishna's plan, whose, quote, movements or phases he had been formulating since the 1940s. So now we're going to take a look at these phases. We'll look at the seeds of the phases in Prabhupada's preaching years in India. And then we'll see how those phases manifested in ISKCON. In a 1950s Back to Godhead article highlighting the importance of absorption and sacred sound, Prabhupada wrote, quote, "Leaders and politicians may take lessons from the life of Mahatma Gandhi in respect of his daily evening prayer meetings and regular recitation of Bhagavad Gita. Reciting the Gita makes one able to get rid of the demoniac way of life and gradually rising up to the plane of pure devotional life of the gods," unquote. That's from a BTG article, 20th May 1956. That year, Prabhupada actually published an issue every month, somehow or other, even though he was by that time poor and had left his family. So launching ISKCON in 1966, Prabhupada was the exemplar of ecstatic devotion. Brows knit, eyes slit in concentration. Quote, "Swamiji led his first followers in chanting Hare Krishna for hours together inside the storefront that first summer, then outside in nearby parks that fall. Those publicized outings were an historic marker in Prabhupada's public outreach." While he continued to expand globally through his followers. Back at the storefront, he would hold Bhagavad Gita classes every Monday. So it's the first phase I call Holy Names and Holy Books. So Prabhupada is in the storefront and out in the parks. He's leading the devotees and chanting Hare Krishna. And then back at the storefront, he's holding regular classes. Back at the storefront, he would hold Bhagavad Gita classes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evening. Since Prabhupada had not finished translating his Bhagavad Gita as it is, he used the version of a famous impersonalist, whose commentary Prabhupada exposed as misleading speculation. Not until late 1968 would his As It Is edition appear, especially for his followers. Till then, Prabhupada himself was the main focus, the holy names and holy books issuing from one empowered holy man. To impress upon his followers their responsibility to continue spreading Krishna's teachings after he was gone, Prabhupada had them start an American edition of Back to Godhead. Rolling off old mimeograph machines at first, by the end of the decade, BTG had become a colorful magazine whose copies ISKCON devotees would offer people gathered round their street chanting parties. These were the infant days of the literature distribution that would become a hallmark of Prabhupada's movement. Phase 2, temples and deities. So first phase was holy names and holy books, temples and deities. In the above-mentioned 1956 BTG article, Prabhupada cited Gandhi's, quote, temple entry movement to show the crucial role temples play in a spiritual revolution. Though Gandhi was known as a, quote, politician among saints, Prabhupada praised him for trying to restore the deity forms of Krishna to temples desecrated by Hindu-Muslim violence. Unfortunately, he wrote, the temples have now become rendezvous of demoniac dance, so many plague spots for preaching atheism. So demoniac dance, I eventually learned, was a reference, was Prabhupada's way of saying that the temples were becoming infested by sahajas, people who were dancing in grotesque ways, pretending that they were in the mood of the gopis. And it was a complete perversion of actual spiritual life. Hence his proposal to regenerate the temples as centers of spiritual education. During ISKCON's launch a decade later, as Prabhupada's raw recruits became practiced to chant Hare Krishna and hear Bhagavad Gita, Krishna deities often appeared first as devotional paintings at low-rent storefronts, then as imported images blessing former churches. So in the beginning, there was no money. So the only way to have centers was to rent these real cheap, rundown storefronts. And then gradually, as devotees came and money and people increased, then the next phase of temples was churches. Like to this day in Los Angeles, they call it New Dwarka, and it formerly had been an old Methodist church. And in Toronto, on Avenue Road, in Toronto, it had formerly been a big stone Catholic church. So that was another phase of the centers. So from storefronts to churches. Surprisingly, quote, homemade forms appeared right away in the first San Francisco temple. Forms meaning deity forms. A storefront in the heart of America's counterculture. So if you've read the Lilamrita, or you know the history, you know that the second center appeared in the Haight-Ashbury and the psychedelic quarter of San Francisco. And the devotees were right in the heart of that at 518 Frederick Street. So it's pretty amazing how deity worship sort of snuck in there. Prabhupada asked a skilled devotee to carve deities modeled after figurines spotted in an import store. So this was Malati, if you know the story. Melanie was shopping for things for the storefront in San Francisco. And she saw these big bins full of what looked like Indian little figurines. So she just took one, didn't pay for it. That was kind of the way it was in the old days. We used to call it liberating the merchandise from the capitalist pigs. That was our counterculture sensibility. So she took one and she brought it back to Swamiji, and she was so surprised when Swamiji, upon seeing the figurine, immediately made pranams and said, Lord Jagannath has come. And then he said, were there any more? So she said, oh yes, there were two more, two big bins, each full of different figurines. So then she brought back Subhadra Maharani and Lord Baladev. And then she said, I wonder if anybody, Prabhupada said to her, do you know if anybody amongst the devotees can carve? So Melanie said, well, Sam can. Sam was not sure if they were married yet, who became Shamsundar. Sam can carve. So Shamsundar carved Lord Jagannath. And then Prabhupada would check up on him during the carving. And Shamsundar says, one day, Swamiji walked in and I was carving, but I was smoking. And my cigarettes were on top of Lord Jagannath's head, the piece of wood that I was carving into the head. So Prabhupada expertly corrected his aspiring disciple. He didn't say anything. Prabhupada just took his cane and put it up against the pack of cigarettes and knocked it way across the room. And Sam looked and was startled. And he got the message that while you're carving a sacred image, you probably shouldn't be smoking. So that was Prabhupada's expertise, you know. He didn't get upset. He just knew how to handle these wild Westerners. So then they had a deity installation after the deities were carved. And there's pictures of this. And then, you know, hippies would wander into the temple and they'd say, hey man, who's that? You know, what's this new thing? And the devotees would nonchalantly say, oh, that's God. So the hippies, being open to anything and everything, would just say, far out, man. And then they follow the devotees' example and they bow down. They bow down to Lord Jagannath. This is God. I mean, to the Western eye, the Jagannath deities, they look kind of like Native American totem poles figures. And native culture was a big part of the hippie culture. So So, yeah, so let's see, what do I say here? So never mind that the carver's wife had stolen them, or that the carver himself wasn't yet following the principles of Krishna consciousness. Inclusive Prabhupada was inviting everyone to appreciate the deity in his unusual form as Jagannath, quote, the Lord of the universe. And where else but in psychedelic San Francisco would people so easily accept Prabhupada's invitation and bow before Jagannath's large, festive eyes? Under those watchful eyes, Prabhupada was thus able to slip past the iconoclasts, the people who would criticize us for being idol worshippers, and introduce deity worship to Westerners. So that was very dramatic and almost like clandestine, like it was like Lord Jagannath just sort of slipped in through the portal of the Haight-Ashbury. That's how deity worship came to ISKCON, in the deity form. Phase 3, initiation and congregation. In a 1949 letter to Indian Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Sardar Patel, Prabhupada wrote, so this is when Prabhupada is still trying to convince Indian leaders to do the Gitanagari. But this letter excerpt shows the third phase of Gandhi's movement, which Prabhupada is trying to use as a way to introduce his revolution. Quote, the third item is to take up the Harijan movement. This movement is, in the real sense, a spiritual initiation movement, and this should be organized in such a manner that people all over the world may take interest in it, unquote. The, quote, Harijan movement was Gandhi's attempt to allow everyone into the temples, not just higher castes, by declaring everyone a Harijan, quote, a person of God. That's true, Prabhupada noted, but in order for everyone to become fit to associate with the Lord, the Harijans must be initiated into a restorative process. As crude metal is said to transmute to gold in an alchemical process, so even a crude human being, by accepting initiation from a bona fide spiritual master, can gradually be restored to his original spiritual nature. Initiated devotees would gradually become the core of a wider congregation, whose history and development would vary from country to country. So this third phase is a good example of how the phases happened in different sequences in different parts of the world. I call this initiation and congregation. So right away in the West, Prabhupada initiated people just to get them into an identity as being Krishna's aspiring devotees. In the East, or in India especially, Prabhupada knew very well that everybody knows about Krishna, at least on some level. So instead of trying to make them Krishna Bhaktas right away, he tried to build a congregation. So that's what we're going to talk about now. When Prabhupada brought his first Western disciples to India, for example, they were the talk of the nation. Why would materially successful Westerners give up everything to dance and sing Hare Krishna in the streets? Quote, you want to imitate Westerners? Prabhupada would chide his countrymen. Then imitate these Westerners. They are fed up with so-called modern civilization, unquote. Rather, quote, the material advancement of the Western countries and the spiritual assets of India should combine for the elevation of all human society. That was Prabhupada's strategy. Combine the wisdom of India with the assets of the West. And that last quote, by the way, was from a Bhagavatam purport. Concerned that Indians might come to see the Western devotees as mere performers, indeed, some were already dismissing them as spiritual hippies or even CIA spies, Prabhupada temporarily suspended their street chanting and engaged them in a new program, life membership. Yeah, remember India was a neutral country during the so-called Cold War, the Soviet Union and the West. and India was trying to stay neutral. So some journalists in India became very suspicious that who were these Westerners? They're presenting themselves as Vaishnavas. Maybe they're just high on LSD. Or maybe the CIA paid Swamiji to bring them into India to spy on us. So there was all kinds of speculation. So Prabhupada saw that. So he stopped the street chanting for a while. And he said, now I'm going to teach you how to do life membership. And he took them to houses of very important people, important business leaders, important government leaders. Because Prabhupada himself had his reputation was good. He was known as a monk and a scholar. He had given his Indian Bhagavatams to the second Prime Minister of India, Lal Bahadur Shastri. So he took the Sankirtan party with him instead to the homes of life members. For supporting ISKCON, members would receive whatever publications and accommodations the society could offer them. Such respectable people would become the first congregational members, as well as invaluable allies in the struggle to establish Prabhupada's movement in India. So I'm thinking especially in Bombay, that Mr. Nair, such a rascal, is taking the devotees' down payment and then try to cheat them out of the land. And Prabhupada knew just what to do, put Radha Rasa Bihari on the land and put some temporary structure up. So Mr. Nair's, his mafia, his thugs, he threatened the devotees, with their guns. So then there was a friend of the devotees, I think Mr. Sethi. And Mr. Sethi, he was a big construction man, big wealthy construction person. So he had his own little army of people to guard his construction sites. So when he heard that Mr. Nair was threatening the devotees, then he brought his own men with air guns. And so there was a standoff. And so that was a good example of how a favorable person, one of the pioneer congregational members, helped the devotees. And Prabhupada knew that. He knew that that was the way to go. The Indian diaspora and the rise of yoga culture worldwide have also helped turn ISKCON into a congregational movement. To move the Hare Krishna movement from the margin to the mainstream, Prabhupada identified a fourth phase his followers still need to embrace and develop. So before I go into the fourth phase, I should alert you that we're approaching the end. So please be thinking about questions and comments. So the fourth phase or movement in the spiritual revolution, I'm just calling it for now the natural life. In the same letter to Dr. Patel, and remember he's the Deputy Prime Minister of India right under Nehru, Prabhupada wrote, quote, "The fourth item is to organize the much discussed caste system as a solution of the natural division of human beings all over the world. Nationalistic division of human races is artificial, but scientific division of the caste system by quality and work, as envisaged in the Bhagavad Gita, is natural," unquote. To show the world a better way to live and to leave, based on the Gita's teachings, is the final phase of Prabhupada's mission. As the body's different parts are equally appreciated for their contribution to the whole body's welfare, so the social body's different classes should be equally valued for their role in serving the Supreme Lord. High or low, head to toe, deep inside, we're all God's servants. And here's a quote from that fourth phase letter to Dr. Patel. Another quote. Quote, "When the Gita Nagari will attempt to harmonize such sweet relation between man and God, man and the world and God, at such an auspicious time only the United Nations' effort to establish peace in the world will be successful, or the dream of a casteless society of spiritual equality all over the world will be realized in practice." And that's from his actually his essay, The Conception of the Gita-Nagari, part 2, and it's written around 1948. Yeah, that wasn't from the letter to Patel. That was another reference to Gita-Nagari. 1948 essay. Because living the way Krishna lives amid his land and cows looks and feels very different from the way most of us live in the modern world, and because the first 3 phases of Prabhupada's mission are perhaps more easily adaptable to modernity, we have been slow to approach this phase 4. So the first 3 phases, again, holy names and holy books, temples and deities, initiation and congregation. So that's more adaptable to the modern urban setting. But now Prabhupada's, he's talking about this whole move back to plain living and high thinking. Yet it is the timeless, this is the timeless and natural spiritual life we in our modern world have been seeking and desperately need to recover. So this lesson, it ends on the doorstep, so to speak, of Varnashram. So when you ask your questions or make your comments, don't comment on Varnashram, because that's the next lesson. The next lesson is called his Varnashram Challenge. I'll read you the transition. It says, with a better understanding of the conception and unfolding of our Founder-Acharya's mission, and lesson 6 will look closer at its unfulfilled phase, known in Sanskrit as Varnashram. Okay. So I'll be very happy to hear your questions and comments now. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. We have some comments that are saying thank you for this class. And there's a question. There are a couple of questions about Varnashram, actually. You know?
No, yeah, that's for next time.
Yeah, I heard you. Yes, and there's one question about back to Godhead. So when Prabhupada said that books are more important, but he still had back to Godhead, do you think we should also have magazines to spread Krishna consciousness? Do you think it's a valuable tool nowadays still?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even as the books came out, Prabhupada loved to receive the latest BTG. It's true that books are more substantial and people don't easily throw them away. But still, magazines are a kind of ongoing update of what's going on in the Hare Krishna movement, and with very topical introductory pieces to Krishna consciousness from different angles, whether it's cow protection or deity worship or life membership, or so it's very valuable. It's not passé or old-fashioned at all. It's a great tool to use along with the books, and that's why Prabhupada restarted it. You know, he started it in 1944 in India, and then what happened in 1966 at 26 Second Avenue in New York City, people started coming to him, and they really wanted to follow him. And some of them, and because it was the counterculture, a lot of them had dropped out and didn't have a place to live. So Prabhupada was very kindly letting them stay in the storefront, the first followers, and even letting them go up to his apartment, which was another building behind the storefront, through a courtyard, and up to apartment 2C, where Swamiji very generously and kindly let these people take a shower. And, there's stories from that part about how the hippies were so unconscious, the hippie followers, the first followers, that even Prabhupada sometimes had to stand in line for his own shower. They didn't have any sense to let Swamiji, go in first. So anyway, that's Prabhupada. He just tolerated it all and just showed by his example that they should help him. And they did. After a while, they started helping him. And then when it became quite a few people living in that storefront. They needed something to do. So Prabhupada, he hit on this idea of let's start an American version of Back to Godhead. So we have that. We have those first issues, and they were run off on this old technology called mimeograph machine, and then stapled together. Yeah, and Prabhupada told his first followers to write something. So they were brand new. They were raw recruits, but you can see in those first issues of Back to Godhead, very touching poems and essays, articles with these counterculture people, just thrilled, with the newness of what Swamiji is revealing to them. And then within a few years, as I mentioned in the talk, it actually became a regular magazine, just very quickly. So, and then it improved over the years. And there was a time also in 1976 and 7, I was living in LA, indexing the Bhagavatams, but BTG went through a phase where the editors and the writers were trying to make BTG more modern, and but they went too far. There was an issue practically where Krishna was hardly mentioned. In the name of bridge preaching and reaching people, where they are. And then Prabhupada saw that and he said, no, this is not right. It's Krishna consciousness. If people want other stuff, there's so many magazines. Eco this and, mystic that. So then Prabhupada put Satsarupa Goswami by that time back in charge of BTD to get it back to the right thing. So it's gone through different phases. Lately, Back to Godhead has become, and I think it still is, its main customers has been the Indian community, whether in South Africa or in America. They're the biggest buyers of BTG. So it's turned into something that's very handy for the Indian community. And now I think I noticed recently they're trying to reach Westerners again in the magazine. Because, in the early days of the movement, there were no books in the beginning. So BTG was the only publication. And it was really addressing, it was by and for those first devotees. So it was very relevant. It had Prabhupada's recipes in there, very homemade and kind of folksy. And then, as the demographic changed of ISKCON, as the Indian community became more and more the audience, then it was speaking more to them. But BTG is trying to get back to a more international flavor, not just the Indian community, who are great. They're great allies, but after all, Prabhupada's pranam mantra is Paschatya Deshatarine. He came to the Western countries and went back all over the world with Westerners. He's trying to reach the modern mind. And still to this day, even people in India, they look to the West. They're always coming to America for education and job opportunities. Of course, it's different now during COVID. So, BTG. There should always be a BTG. Prabhupada once called BTG the backbone of the Hare Krishna movement. So what's a movement without a backbone? Thank you for a good question.
Thank you for such a detailed and deep answer. Thank you very much. And one more question, if you allow.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about this liberating the merchandise of capitalist pigs, so to say. Do you remember any instances or maybe stories of how Prabhupada dealt with it? Because when Malati Prabhu came here a couple of years ago, she told us the story about that and how Prabhupada dealt with that. Maybe you can tell us some other stories, if anything comes to mind.
You mean how Prabhupada dealt with the devotees' tendency to steal things and justify it? Well, first of all, I'd like to hear in a nutshell, what did Malati, how did Swamiji deal with that?
He told her not to do it anymore.
Don't steal things. Okay. Yeah. Well, this was going on when I joined a few years later. It was 1970. And I know there were these infamous raids on cemeteries and parks where flowers were placed as memorials, for loved ones, or planted in parks. So again, we didn't have any money, so it was kind of like we felt like ourselves like Robin Hood from English legend. He robbed from the rich to give to the poor. So we were the poor, but we were taking things, in this case flowers, to offer to the deities, because we didn't have any good flowers to make garlands or anything. We didn't have any money to buy flowers, and we didn't have any place to grow them. It was just these, cement storefronts and hardly any land or yard. So yeah, so that was similar. When Prabhupada found out about that, he also said, no, you shouldn't do this, because we're presenting ourselves as we're principled. We have values, we have principles. So if they find out that we're stealing stuff, then it's going to ruin the preaching. It's going to be a contradiction. So yeah, we have to be law-abiding and set an example. So let's see. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of. When I joined, we heard about this. Let's see, was that going on in Boston? Because I joined in Boston. If it was going on, I probably wasn't aware of it, but I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, but we just heard in LA that was going on. And Prabhupada, because they were giving Prabhupada these gorgeous garlands of roses, these big, down to Prabhupada's feet, they would garland him and and then, oh yeah, in LA, that's right, because in LA, they planted rose bushes. And there's one, I think there's one part of the Lambrita, it's called 108 rose bushes. And LA has a mild climate, so they were able to get a lot of roses most of the year, after Prabhupada said they shouldn't steal them. So they planted rose bushes, because Southern California is a very nice climate. Let's see, stealing. Well, I guess can't think off the top of my head. No, I can't think. Sorry.
It's okay. Yesterday we had the live stream with Jayashri Prabhu, and she was reading some extracts from the new book, Bond of Love.
Okay, who did you have on?
Jayashri Prabhu from New Vrindavan.
Jayashri, yeah, old Hawaii devotee.
Yeah, from Hawaii, that's right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And she read some extracts from the Bond of Love that was recently published about stories of Vaishnavis, disciples of Prabhupada. And that was, we really enjoyed it. And then Krishna Nandini, she writes that Prabhupada was the one who always fanned the sparkle of Krishna consciousness.
Who always what? She did what?
Prabhupada fanned the spark.
Oh, fan the spark. Yes, that's in connection with her joining. Did you have her on too?
No, we don't, but she gives a lot of classes online. It is just, I found that very beautiful and wanted to share with you.
Yeah, well, that's quite a story, because she's in an African-American body, and the white devotees didn't want to let them in the temple in Cleveland, where they're from, or in Dallas. But Prabhupada let them in, and so Prabhupada was being advised, because they all came. They drove all the way from Cleveland to Dallas. It was like 1,000 miles or something, So they wanted to be part of the Hare Krishna movement. And it was basically Krishnanandini's mother. I forget her name. She's passed on now. And dear Krishnanandini, I hear, is not doing so well either with that cancer. But they wanted to be, there was a lot of them. You know, there was like maybe a dozen of them. So, but they were kind of a wild card. You know, nobody really knew if they were following principles or if they were chanting rounds. And the mother was a former, we say in English, a holy roller. She was a real African-American, praise the Lord, hallelujah type of lady. And so she struck the devotees as being eccentric. So they were telling Prabhupada, no, Prabhupada, we don't know these people really, so I wouldn't initiate them. But Prabhupada heard all their advice, and then he went ahead and he initiated 2 or 3 of them at least, the ones that seemed to be the most Krishna conscious. And Prabhupada just told them, just what you said. He said, whenever I see a spark of Krishna consciousness, it's my duty to fan it. And that's one of Krishnanandini's favorite stories, maybe her favorite story. She was initiated, and her mother, and maybe another brother of hers. Yeah.
The 2 brothers and her stepfather. We read about that yesterday.
Say it again.
Her stepfather and her 2 brothers also.
Oh, okay. All right. So more than a couple. Yeah. Several. Yeah. So that's Prabhupada.
Jai Srila Prabhupada. Dear Sureshwara Prabhu, I think these are all questions and comments that we've got so far. And please accept our deepest gratitude. And we're so appreciating and loving your classes. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. And next one, his Varnashram challenge, is very interesting for the Russian Sangha, because we're going to talk about how Prabhupada tried to present Varnashram to Professor Kotovsky in Moscow. That's also part of it. So I think you'll be very interested to hear. Of course, you probably know that conversation, but from the Varnashram angle, it's really interesting. Hey. Hare Krishna.